everyone, welcome to my channel. It's your girl Amanda the author, and thanks for tuning in. I'm really excited about today's video because we are talking about villains. That's right, we're talking about those characters who you hate or who you're supposed to hate but secretly love. Specifically, I'm going to be giving you 5 do's and don'ts for how to write villains that are compelling, fun, memorable, and just plain good. And yes, I did wear my brightest sweater to talk about those characters who are supposed to thrive in the darkness. You're welcome. Now, today's topic was recommended to me by KJ. You can find her at Read Love Listen here on YouTube and Instagram. So shout out to you, KJ. Thanks for recommending this. I'm going to put a link to her YouTube in the description below. Go ahead and subscribe to her. She's a wonderful bookstagrammer and she has a lot of great insight. Now, before I get started, if you're an author and you're looking for tips on all aspects of the authoring process, from writing to book marketing to author self-care, because yes, that's a huge part of authoring, especially if you are an indie author, then I'd love to have you go ahead and subscribe to my channel and kick it with me every Thursday. And if you're interested in what I'm doing aside from hanging out in these YouTube streets, you can find links in the description to buy my books, sign up for my newsletter, and follow me on all my other social media channels. Let's get started. So I'm sure you know what a villain is by now, but I'm going to give you a quick definition just so that we have a basic understanding of what a villain's role is in the story. So the villain or antagonist is a character or characters whose motivations and actions diametrically oppose your protagonist or main character. They are the ones who drive your main character's arc in the story, often drive the story itself, as your character is working to figure out ways to defeat the villain or discover the villain, and so on and so forth. So some of my favorite villains of all time include Scar from The Lion King, even though I hate that he's queer-coded, Andronic or Adam from The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson, Grace from Nana by Brendan Massey, James Harris and Carter Campbell from The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. And if you read the book and don't think Carter Campbell is a villain, fight me, because the man is terrible. Valerie from The Beautiful Ones by Sylvia Moreno Garcia, Father Paul Hale in the show Midnight Mass, obviously Thanos from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, to that point Killmonger from Black Panther, obviously Gollum, obviously Sauron, obviously Saruman from the Lord of the Rings trilogies. Also Smaug is a good villain as well. Shelob, I mean, Lord of the Rings, so many good villains you can kind of pick from. And I wasn't a huge Game of Thrones fan, but I watched the show a little bit, so I'm going to say Joffrey and Cersei are kind of iconic villains that I have kind of seen and know about. That's by no means an exhausted list. Those are just kind of the ones that came to my brain right now. But what about you? Who are some of your favorite villains? Let me know in the comments below. Now, quiet is kept, as much as I really enjoy writing my main characters, Mercury is probably one of my favorite characters I've ever written because he's so complex and morally gray, if I'm being completely honest. I would have to say I had a lot of fun writing the villains in my series, and in the book I just finished writing, In the House of Transcendence, I had a lot of fun writing the villains in this book as well. So I think part of why we're drawn to villains, and us as authors especially, is because they can be fun to write. They're fun to kind of explore the dark side, and with a good villain you're really able to get into the nitty-gritty, like dirty evil of it all. And notice I said good villain, right? Because we've all read or watched or whatever works where the villain ain't shit, and we're kind of sitting there like, why did I invest myself in this? So that's why I'm going to be walking you through these do's and don'ts. First do is do give your villain a backstory. You might be thinking that the more mysterious your villain is, the better, but that's actually not true. In order to have your villain be a fully realized character, they need to have at least a little bit of backstory. Now, I'm not talking about a full-on info dump. I'm not even saying you need to have chapters from their perspective where they're telling us about their childhood or them being born again into this vampire life. But having a little bit more context to them, who they are, who they've been, will help to make them a fully realized 3-dimensional character, just like your main character. Not only does it help make your villains fully realized characters, but it can also help your audience empathize with them because they understand a little bit more about who they are and therefore some of their motivations. So one example I can give is Valerie from the book The Beautiful Ones, which I mentioned earlier as being one of my favorite villains. So this book is unique in that we do get some chapters from Valerie's perspective, but through that we learn a little bit more about her and why she is the way she is. She's somebody who was forced to marry for money instead of marry for love because her family, which had once been rich, is now poor. And so she had that obligation to marry even though she was in love. She's also growing up in a society that puts a premium on a woman having a certain type of appearance and acting a certain way. And so not only is she feeling this pressure to always have this etiquette, but she's also propagating that belief as well, and that's part of what makes her such a villain, is that she's not letting her cousin, Nina, be great and be herself. I kind of feel a little bit of a sympathy for her and kind of empathize with Valerie at least a little bit, but don't get me wrong, she's still a stone cold piece. Now, on to the don't. Don't make them a stereotype. You might be inclined, like I said, to make this a character who is mysterious and thrives in the shadows and is a man sitting there twirling his mustache. And if that works for your narrative, like, cool. But remember that just because your villain is an antagonist and maybe evil in certain circumstances, it does not mean that they can't have nuance and that they should be completely flat with no moments of kindness or moments of slightly less evil to them. Remember, a villain who is fully realized will help compel your readers to sympathize with them and actually kind of see where they're coming from in certain instances. So don't make them a stereotype and do give them at least a little bit of a backstory. Now, the next do is do make your villain believe their own hype. I don't just mean writing a villain who believes that they are the shit, although that tends to be one of my favorite villains. Somebody who has the utmost amount of confidence in their own abilities, their cleverness, their looks, what have you. I mean that your villain should believe that the things they are doing are right and that the ends justify the means, even if what they're doing is because of their own survival, right? Like Dracula needs blood to live. You have to have a villain believe so deeply that the things that they are doing are justified. As in the case of Killmonger, right? Killmonger is somebody who desperately wants to help his people. He feels a great deal of resentment and rage towards T'Challa and his father and the whole of Wakanda because they basically abandoned him and his father and killed his father. And he also feels this huge resentment because here is this technologically advanced Black Kingdom who has turned its back on every single Black person in the world despite having knowledge that all these Black people worldwide are suffering. And he fully believes that Wakanda should be using its technology and resources to help uplift Black people and help them not be oppressed. Who doesn't fucking believe that that's something that should be done, right? But Killmonger is not going about it in healthy ways, in justified ways that we would say are morally right, and that's what makes him a villain. Again, his belief is not the issue, it's the way that he is going about these things that make him the villain. And we see even in the end T'Challa agrees with Killmonger, and a lot of Killmonger's belief and essence rubs off on T'Challa, who finally in the end decides that it's time to reveal Wakanda and start sharing resources and helping his people worldwide. Now, like I said, it's fun when you have your characters believe very deeply in their own abilities, in who they are, because this can be a good contrast to your main character. Let's say you have a villain who is convinced that they are the smartest person in the world. Maybe your main character is not that smart or doesn't believe in their own abilities. Maybe you have your villain believe that they are completely flawless, untouchable. And maybe your main character struggles with self-esteem. This is a good contrast in having your main character and villain literally mirror personality traits. My next don't is, don't make your villains evil just because evil's gonna do what it's gonna do. That's really boring. It leads to flat characterization. Nobody wants to read about a villain that is just evil. We don't know why they're evil. They're just existing. They're just like a beast. They're just, vampire's gonna vampire, yo. The Thing is gonna just be the Thing. Jaws is just gonna be Jaws because Jaws. It's really great when you have situations where the villain has a reason for what they're doing. Now, this next thing I'm going to say might be a little controversial, so bear with me. But even Lucifer, right? Capital T, capital E, the evil, has motivations for being evil. He was cast out of heaven, and so he spends his time corrupting people and fucking around with God's favorite toy, despite humans having free will, right? He sends his minions out to do the same. So even like the supreme evil has motivation, and so your villain can have motivation too. Now my next do is make sure that your villain is a worthy adversary. Remember, this is a character who can drive the character arc for your main character and tension in the story, and so they should be a worthy adversary. You've all read books and seen movies or TV shows where the villain is easily dispatched, and that's boring as fuck. Why have a villain if they're just gonna be easily taken down by a blow to the head or a simple incantation and there's no fight back? Nobody wants to consume that type of content. Part of why a villain is fun is because we have a moment there of thinking, oh goodness, they're gonna win. Our main character is not going to be able to overcome this character, and that adds to the stakes and to the tension. And so your villain needs to be one who is worthy of battling your main character. Now, one way to do this is to mirror your main character's abilities, like I mentioned earlier, but also make your villain slightly more leveled up than your main character. Maybe they're smarter than your main character. Maybe they're physically stronger than your main character, or maybe they have magic and your main character doesn't. Maybe they're a supernatural creature or being and your main character is just a human. Part of your main character's arc and adventure in this book is them leveling up, either mentally, also perhaps physically, to be able to defeat this villain. And whether that's them getting magic, whether that's them assembling their crew, or whether that's having an 80s movie montage where they're training with a combat specialist so they can learn how to sweep the leg. Make sure that your villain is worthy, so your main character has to put in the work to be able to defeat them, and we as readers feel that tension and wonder, is the good person gonna win? However, my next don't is don't make your villain so strong that we have no faith in your main character. Again, your villain should be villainy, your villain should be worthy, but we should also have at least a little bit of faith in your main character to defeat them at the end of the day. Now, I don't mean that your main character has to win every battle, because that's fucking boring too. I mean that your main character should take their lumps. Maybe they win one battle, a couple battles, maybe they lose somebody along the way, maybe they lose themselves along the way and kind of descend into madness or descend a little bit into the abyss that they're gazing into. However, they should ultimately be the ones who win the war, even if it's just a marginal win or winning by the skin of their teeth. And if you're reading your book back or you're writing it and you're finding that your main character is easily faked out and played like a sucker, then that's an issue with your main character, not necessarily your villain. Remember, we should feel the tension of, is your main character going to be the one that gets victory? But I think at the back of the head, you should kind of know that, yes, they're gonna win in the end of the day. Do give your villains their own character arc. Like I said, your villain's actions are the things that are powering your main character's actions throughout the story, and vice versa. I'm sure you've heard the line that every villain is really just a protagonist of their own story, and that your main character is the antagonist in their story. So it's important to make sure that your villain has some kind of character arc. I'm not saying that that automatically means that they start becoming good. Not every villain needs to be a Spike from Buffy the Vampire Slayer or a Rowena from Supernatural, but the events of the book should change them too. Now that change could be them further descending into evil or doubling down on the negative beliefs that they had, or it could be them again coming to the winning team, like a Spike or Rowena or Crowley even, or their arc could end with them dead. No matter how subtle, your villains need some type of arc. That said, my next stone is don't forget your character's core. Now, if you make your villains step into the light, it's important to remember that at one point they were adversaries. At one point, they maybe even tried to kill your main character. So don't just have them join the winning team and there's no tension between your main character and this person. There has to be potentially some trust issues. And also, maybe they still have some of those same tendencies, especially if you have a character who's been a murderer or who has used magic to harm people. It's going to be really hard for them to just automatically give those things up. Best example I can give of this is Helena from the show Orphan Black. Now, Helena is somebody who's raised in a convent, raised to believe that she's the original clone, and therefore spent most of the first season going around trying to kill all of the clones. And she actually kills a couple of them before she stopped and before she encounters Sarah, who she does try to kill. Now, she becomes an anti-hero through kind of the end of the first season, second season, throughout the rest of the show, and has moments of genuine care and genuinely wanting to do right by people around her. But at the same time, she is somebody who is a killer. So she burns down a cult house, probably killing people. She kills a villain just as he's about to harm Allison, one of her sister clones. And then she kills a caster clone, who is the male version of the female clones in this series, because he's actively pursuing Helena and the other sister clones. And also because he's a rapist and, like, Helena doesn't play that. However, she then also kills 3 drug dealers who have really nothing to do with the overall everything that's happening with the sisters. And this triple homicide kind of hangs over the rest of the group for the rest of the show. Likewise, if you have a character who started as good and then was corrupted by evil, it's important that they still have moments of nuance and moments where they're compassionate, maybe they're kind, and maybe they're hesitating to carry out these evil acts, or maybe they go super overboard and start becoming more evil than everybody else to kind of prove themselves. Your character's nature doesn't automatically change just because they switch teams. My final do is have fun. As I mentioned before, as much as I enjoyed writing Mercury, I had a blast writing the villains in my book series, namely President Harvey Vale, who's a vampire, and Mercury's aunt, Oleana, who's the head of the Witches' Council. I had a lot of fun writing them and weaving in their motivations and writing their backstory. I loved writing Vale as a nuanced but clearly obvious villain, and I loved writing Oleana in a much more insidious way, especially because Oleana is Mercury's aunt, so Mercury still feels a great deal of conflict whenever he's coming against her, because this is a woman who is blood. She kind of helped raise him. She was there for him as a mother figure after his mother died, and he really doesn't want to take her down, but he realizes that he has to. Now, part of the fun is being able to think outside the box with who your villains are, how they present themselves, the way they look. Not every villain has to be ugly, not every villain has to be deep voiced or big, huge, and hulking, or even an adult. Some of the creepiest villains are children, like Rhoda from The Bad Seed, Macaulay Culkin's character in The Good Son, and most recently, Alma in American Horror Story Double Feature. And my final don't, and this one's really important, is don't be harmful. Don't be harmful. It's 2022 in the year of our Lord Beyonce. There's no reason at all that your villain should be a harmful caricature of a culture, identity, or non-Christian religion. There's no reason. So avoid going the Disney route and having your villain be queer-coded like Scar or Ursula and have them be the villain against a bunch of straight people. It sends a message that to be queer is evil. And if you want to learn a little bit more about what queer coding is, there's a great video by The Take that you can find here on YouTube that talks about queer coding. Avoid writing the evil voodoo practitioner who curses a bunch of white people, because that reinforces the common view that voodoo is evil and something to be feared when it is not at all. It's a religious practice. It's just different from Christianity and is not something that should be cast in that light. Avoid making your villain black and your main characters white, because, like, duh. There's no reason that you can't address issues of classism, sexism, racism, homophobia, xenophobia, all of that in your works. You should, and I think good literature does those things. But by placing a member of a marginalized and often maligned group in the shoes of a villain against a main character or characters who are not part of the same marginalized group is really treading dangerous waters, and I would probably just avoid it altogether. So if you have any kind of concerns about your villain and their representation being harmful, I would encourage you to seek out beta readers and sensitivity readers and have them read your work. You should be doing it anyway. You should be having other people read your work before you publish it. But specifically, if you are an author who's not part of a marginalized group and you have characters, villain or no, of this marginalized group, you should probably engage either sensitivity readers or beta readers, and there's a distinction there, to look at your work and give you feedback. And if they do give you feedback and tell you that your representation is harmful, listen to them and make the changes that you need. I promise you it's not a big deal. I promise you nobody's doing it to be malicious. They want you to succeed, and so you should probably listen to them, take what they're saying, digest it, and make your book better. Now that's all for me today. If you've made it this far, go ahead and leave a note about what you think makes a good villain. I'm trying to see something. So if you'd like to follow me, you can find me on Instagram and TikTok at Amanda the Author with 2 E's, and on Twitter as Amanda the Author with 1 E. I have the links in the description below. If you'd like to get my newsletter, I send it out bi-weekly, and I talk a little bit more about books and make recommendations there. So if you want to add to your TBR list, go ahead and sign up for my newsletter in the description below. Also, you can find links to buy these 3 books, To a Stereo with Love, To a Larson Desperation, and Girls of Might and Magic in the description as well. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for kicking it with me, and I will catch y'all later. Bye!